Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zach Cunningham. I'm a hydrogen lead with the Transition Accelerator. First of all, I'd really like to take a moment to thank everyone who is in attendance today. I'd also like to acknowledge the organizations that we're co-presenting this webinar with. That's Calgary Economic Development and Wheatland County. So without further ado, I'm going to share my slides. And I hope it's working for everyone. So yeah, let's get started. I'll be presenting the first part of this webinar that's going to be covering some of the fundamentals of hydrogen based on some of the learnings that we've experienced so far in the Transition Accelerator. After that, Dr. David Lizelle will be presenting some of the high-level findings from the Calgary Foundational Report, and then we're going to wrap up with a bit of a Q&A session. So to that end, I would certainly encourage participants to submit questions throughout the webinar. And potentially, talk a little bit about where they're from in the chat or whatever they feel is best. And we're going to do our best to answer those questions that do come in. In addition, it would be greatly appreciated if you folks could fill out our post-webinar survey, particularly with topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future. So for my part here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about, in my presentation, the current status of hydrogen in Alberta, the carbon intensity of hydrogen production, some of the identified hydrogen fuel markets of the future, value chain development, and building scale. So hydrogen in Alberta. What I'll do is I'll direct you to the left side of the slide here. We have hydrogen production in Alberta and in Canada on the left, and on the right side, we have a pie chart with hydrogen end use. So if we look back on the left here, we look at hydrogen production. We can see that Alberta produced around 6,600 tons a day based on 2020 numbers. Keep in mind, these will be about 500 tons per day higher in 2024, roughly. But for comparison's sake, we can see that certainly in 2020, Alberta produced the vast lion's share of hydrogen in Canada, with the national total only being around 8,200 tons per day, or a little over 3 million tons annually. So really, when we talk about hydrogen in Canada, we're really talking about Alberta here. And of that hydrogen production, nearly all of it's derived from natural gas currently. And if you look on the right pie chart, you can see that the majority, all of it's really used for feedstock purposes, with the majority being used for oil refining and oil upgrading and the production of chemicals. And of those chemicals, it's most notable that, it's methanol and ammonia makes up the majority there. And so really, at the end of the day, Alberta is a hydrogen producing powerhouse, especially for feedstock end use. However, using hydrogen as a fuel is new and hasn't really made an impact on hydrogen demand yet. So carbon intensity, really what it's all about with the move towards hydrogen is trying to reduce our carbon intensity away from incumbent fuels. So really, when we talk about hydrogen production, it is really important to recognize some of the nuances in production methods and carbon intensities, more so than probably the colors themselves, even though, colors seem to make themselves most noticed on social media and other forms of communication. So what I would do is ask you to look at this figure, and if you look at the vertical axis, you can see that is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen production, and each of the bars is a different type of production method. So we can see on the far left side, we can see unabated steam methane reforming, followed by kind of an average value for autothermal reforming. We see an example of a Quest steam methane reforming. And then on the right, we see ATR high performance and SMR high performance. And these would be kind of the lower boundaries of what's theoretically possible for that. And of course, these all include carbon capture aside from the unabated SMR. Now, if you look to the right of those, we see those tall gray bars. And these are examples of electrolytic hydrogen production. And these are based off of provincial grid carbon intensities. So you can see some very big differences between Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan. So really, the big takeaway from this slide, from this figure, is that carbon intensity is very region specific and very project specific. We can produce both low or high carbon intensity from natural gas or from electrolysis. So it's really important to understand some of the factors that make up this intensity when looking closer at them. For example, methane leakage, which is, for example, very much a field or operator specific factor, and grid carbon intensity. And really, at the end of the day, it's, as with most things in the energy world, it depends is the answer. green is not good and blue is not bad. It's more nuanced than that. So if we talk about hydrogen fuel markets of the future, certainly there are a number of use cases that hydrogen could fill a role. But in its early stages of adoption, really we should be focused on the most economic use cases. And well, what are those? So if you look at the figure on the slide here, we can see ranges of what we pay for energy based on the energy carrier. The gray bars are wholesale prices, while the black bars are the retail prices we generally pay, the historical ranges. So if you look on the left axis, we've converted that on an energetic basis, Canadian dollars per gigajoule, higher heating value. And you can clearly see, between natural gas heating and diesel transportation, that transportation, we pay a lot more on an energetic basis for that energy than we do for heating. And if we look now at some of the costs of producing hydrogen, we can see that we have green, which is, in that $3.5 to $7 range-ish, and that's mostly linked to electricity costs, of course. And then beneath that, you can see we have blue hydrogen, natural gas-derived hydrogen, more in that $1.50 to $3.50 range. And again, that's due to the larger scales of how these operations work. And if we account for, efficiency improvements in a transition to hydrogen, accounting for fuel cell efficiencies versus internal combustion engines, this brings our target price for where we want to be, at the fueling station or at the pipeline, more to that $5 to $8 range at the fueling station, and more in that $1.50 to $2.75, $3 for pipeline delivered heating. So really, at this is transportation is likely going to be the first pillar of hydrogen demand, and that's what we should be focused on and in the initial stages. Now, when we talk about hydrogen adoption, having a comparable price on an energetic basis is great, but we really can't forget that there is equipment and infrastructure and people needed to produce, transport, and use hydrogen, and that's a whole new value chain that needs to be built up. So you can see in this example figure here, we do have some existing demand, some existing production, but there are a whole number of other areas that need to be developed in terms of storage, transporting, OEMs, all the manufacturers, all the parts that needed to go into all these little parts. So there's many direct and indirect stakeholders in this value chain. So in addition to building a value chain, kind of all from the ground up, which is a challenge, it is also necessary to build and aggregate demand at the same time. So this figure on the screen right now is just an example of a scenario that really highlights how increased demand will make costs go down. But really, the challenge here is getting through a somewhat painful, uneconomic stage to get here. And arguably, we're here right now in that painful, uneconomic stage. So to alleviate this is kind of where the idea of aggregating demand through hubs and corridors comes in. So what could a hub and corridor approach look like for Alberta or for Calgary? We can see in this figure that this could look like a series of regional hubs connected by transportation corridors. And really that would be started with the Edmonton hub that has significant supply available and has some demand built up. So we look at building demand off the initial demand built by the Edmonton hub. It's really only natural to consider Calgary as the next place. Particularly the transportation corridor that is between them. This corridor could be the core initial demand needed to spur initial infrastructure investments and supply, to which other potential end uses could tap into. So in conclusion, really, I just wanted to highlight some of the really high-level points is Alberta is a major hydrogen producer already. Carbon intensity should be the focus of hydrogen supply, not necessarily color. Transportation demand should be the focus initially. And value chain development and building scale really is key. And a hubs and corridors approach is a solution to this. So highlighting some of these opportunities next is my colleague, Dr. David Lazell, who I will graciously pass the webinar over to talk a little bit more about the Calgary Foundational Report.
Great. Thank you very much, Zach. We'll get you to stop sharing your slides and I'll be able to get in there and share a few. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is a lot of it's going to be referring to a report that we published almost 2 years ago, and it's shown on the chart on the right here, towards a fuel hydrogen economy in the Calgary region. And that was published in February 2023. And so I've been drawing a fair amount from that report, but also making a few changes in the presentation today. I think I'd want to recognize that, this we're talking about here is the region of Calgary. It's the traditional territory of the peoples of Treaty 7, includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising Siksika, the Piikani and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. It's also Calgary is, of course, home to the Métis Nations of Alberta in District 5 and 6. So what I'm going to be doing today is, we're going to recognize initially the sponsors that helped us in the report that was published 2 years ago, and they're shown on this chart. And the region that we are talking specifically about, what we call the Calgary region, includes Calgary is showing in the chart on the bottom here, Calgary, the townships of Wheatland, Rocky View, and Foothills, and the First Nations communities of Stoney Nakoda, Tsuut'ina, and the Siksika. The population in the whole area is about 1.64 million in 2021. It's somewhat higher than that today because we've seen significant population growth in the last few years. But in 2021, it represented about 37% of the Alberta population. So some of the numbers I'll be using in this report will look at some Alberta estimates, and we'll take 37% of that to estimate what might be the opportunity within Alberta for a new hydrogen economy. The outline that I'm going to be presenting in my part of this presentation today is to begin with what is needed for a new hydrogen economy within Canada and specifically within the Calgary region. Then we're going to do some bottom-up estimates of hydrogen demand by key stakeholders within the Calgary region. And then I'll go on to talk about some top-down estimates of hydrogen demand in the entire Calgary region based on as a subset of a provincial opportunity. And then we'll look at opportunities for low GHG hydrogen supply, where you could get it from and how it get to where you need it. And then end with a brief mention about a hydrogen vehicle project that's now ongoing by the city of Calgary that I think is really part of what we are hoping to see happen more and more in the Calgary region. And then we'll have an opportunity for a discussion, I hope. So what is needed in a new hydrogen economy? Well, I think what we have to do is start by looking at our existing hydrogen economy in Canada and in Alberta. And it's basically shown on this chart here on the left. We have a large centralized production of hydrogen, and then right next door to it, there's industrial feedstock markets, and that's mostly in production of chemicals like ammonia or methanol, or in oil processing, either cracking bitumen to make synthetic crude oil or upgrading oil to refined petroleum products. If we're going to move to a new hydrogen economy, this is kind of what we have to add to our existing system and extend it. We have to switch it to low greenhouse gas hydrogen production that can be used both for traditional markets of chemical and oil processing, but also expand perhaps to new markets. For example, there's an opportunity to use hydrogen in the making of steel and dramatically reduce the carbon intensity of steel production. And as we look more and more at biofuels, hydrogen can play a very important role in upgrading biofuels to be more higher quality drop-in fuels and to increase the productivity of biofuel production in actually providing a drop-in fuel alternative to traditional fossil fuels. It's also possible to move hydrogen from any centralized production to more distributed use, and this is going to be needed in new markets. We have to create then in totally new value chains to serve these new markets for hydrogen. For example, the transportation markets where we're talking about heavy trucks and buses and trains, our heavy-duty hydrogen vehicle users are going to require transportation to move that hydrogen, fueling stations, and as well as, of course, vehicle manufacturers to make those vehicles because our existing infrastructure for using hydrogen usually can't take hydrogen in its current in the current design of those engines and those technologies. The same is possible when you're looking at the possibility of using hydrogen for heat, power, or for export markets. We need, in that case, to move it by pipeline. And because it's the only thing that can get the price down to a way where it has a hope of actually meeting end-use requirements for space and water heating, for industrial heat and power generation, or for export markets. And of course, there's going to be new equipment, new types of furnaces or technologies needed to gas turbines, et cetera, to serve that requirement. So what's required here is totally new value chains. And I think as we're talking about setting up and creating opportunities for hydrogen as a zero-emission energy carrier, it's important that we explore all the opportunities that come available within particular regions. And there's huge regional differences in the magnitude of the opportunities that one finds across Canada. But the fact that, as Zach just talked about, we pay more for transportation fuels than we do for fuels for heating and power. So the largest early stage opportunities for commercialization and large scale deployment seem to be in the heavy duty transportation sector. So I think, that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today, but not all of what we'll be talking about. And for all of these things, we need projects to actually pilot new ideas and new initiatives and see if they really work, to demonstrate them and to get some of the key decision makers comfortable with this as a different way of perhaps delivering energy services, and then ultimately to commercialize those technologies. A number of, over the last 5 years, especially with the work that's been done in the Edmonton region and the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen Hub, there's been a lot of pilot and demonstration projects, but there also been a lot of really exciting things happening in the Calgary region as well. This is kind of a high level over. It's certainly not comprehensive, and I'm sorry to those who I've left your picture out of these, but the Alberta Motor Transportation Association, which operates across Alberta, and Calgary and Edmonton and other parts of Alberta, have been very active in trying to bring large heavy-duty vehicles, hydrogen fueled vehicles forward, and everything from the ACE-TEC project and with support from Prairie's Cran and Emission Reductions Alberta. There have been a hydrogen fuel cell bus projects operating in both Edmonton and Strathcona. And in Calgary, of course, we're all very proud about the work that the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway as a company is building some of the first in the world hydrogen fuel cell electric locomotives. And more recently, ATCO has built a hydrogen heated home, and recently you've probably seen it. And in Calgary, District Heating, Atlantica has actually been piloting or testing the co-firing of hydrogen with natural gas for district heat in downtown Calgary. And so exciting work that they've been doing there. It's clear that we need more pilot and demonstration projects as we move forward to try to test out and explore setting up these new value chains for a hydrogen economy. But we also need to advance the early stage commercialization of these new value chains for new uses for hydrogen. And I'd like to just make a comment in the next chart about give an example of an early stage commercialization project to give you an idea of the scale at which we need to be starting to think about as we try to take some of these early learnings from pilots and demonstration projects and move them into commercialization and actually on the ground transformation of our energy systems. And the one that I'd like to focus on is really around long-haul trucking companies. We see those in the transition accelerator, we see those as really the key stakeholders. And I think it's because eventually they are going to pay all of the costs associated with creating this new value chain. Those companies have to buy the vehicles and they have to buy the fuel in order to deliver the transportation services that they're hired to deliver. And like any chain, a value chain is only good as its weakest link. And so it's very important that as we look at trying to develop strategies for moving to a lower carbon emission or net zero future, that we are recognizing that all parts of the value chain have to actually make a profit and see opportunities in moving forward in order to keep this value chain together and to be successful and long-term for commercialization. for the trucking companies, one of the first things they look for before they would ever consider buying a vehicle from a manufacturer is whether the fueling stations are available. And I would argue that we have to really start seriously developing a focus on fueling stations. And our analysis, and that of many others, is that in order to create an economically viable fueling station, we need to really be looking at something in the range of 4 tons of hydrogen per station per day. You also need a commitment for at least 10 years on the that this station is going to be able to deliver that kind of hydrogen in 10 years in order to be able to write down the fairly significant capex cost it creates to create one of these stations. And we would argue that in looking at opportunities around Canada and specifically in Alberta, the greatest opportunity is the Edmonton to Calgary corridor. And the importance of focusing on a hydrogen corridor, we need really 3 fueling stations there, one in Edmonton, one in Red Deer, and one in Calgary, in order to provide a little bit of redundancy if one of the stations goes down, so you could actually still move vehicles with 2 stations. But it also means that what you have is essentially a scale where we can get enough demand and enough vehicles in order to make this whole value chain work. So in order to provide that 4 tons of hydrogen a day, in the heavy-duty trucking sector, these vehicles are used a lot. And we're talking then in over a 4-year period, we have to build to a stock of about 184 of these trucks running this corridor back and forth, essentially driving 300 days a year, 6 days a week, 650 kilometers a day per vehicle per day. So that would mean a vehicle would drive from Calgary to Edmonton and back to Calgary in a day. And that's typically the way many of the long-haul trucking companies operate on this route. We estimate that they'll be using about 0.1 kilogram of hydrogen for every kilometer. So each truck would use about 65 kilograms of hydrogen per vehicle per day, driving about 195,000 kilometers per year for each vehicle. And these vehicles would only last 4 years before they're basically going to need a major overhaul and be traded off into either into oblivion or into short haul markets. For the vehicle manufacturer, this would, in providing these vehicles, we're looking at 46 heavy duty long haul vehicles sold every year for 10 years. And that's 460 vehicles in total. But of course, after 4 years, they start to be retired and we get this steady state number of 184 trucks on the road. In order to provide that fuel to the fueling station, one would need to actually make about 12 tons of hydrogen per day. That doesn't have to be made in all one location. It could be made in different locations. For Calgary, and what Calgary would need to be delivering is on 4 tons a day, it would provide 1/3 of the hydrogen needed on this transportation system. And to deliver the hydrogen would probably need liquid hydrogen fuel cells. This is the only one that's economically viable in the early stages. Liquid hydrogen. Liquid hydrogen is a 253 degrees below zero. It's a cryogenic fluid. And it's challenging to make, but it can be made, and it's basically jet fuel or rocket fuel that's used in rockets, liquid hydrogen, and it could be transported in trucks. And I'll show you a picture of one of those trucks a little bit later. And the idea is each carry about 2 tons of liquid hydrogen per vehicle, and it would need about 6 to supply this system. So the number I'd like you to remember from this, because we're going to be using this number throughout the rest of the presentation, is the 4 tons of hydrogen per day. That's kind of in my mind, the starting point from a Calgary perspective. 4 tons as part of a 12 ton of hydrogen per day as 1/3 of this route to really get this energy system off the ground. This would be, I would say, one of the early building blocks of an early stage commercialization project. Let's now, with that in mind, that 4 tons, 12 ton a day sort of hydrogen marker, if you like, let's look at some bottom-up estimates of hydrogen demand from key stakeholders. We'll go back and start by looking at the trucking on the provincial roads in Alberta around Calgary. And we'll look at specifically the City of Calgary vehicles and the airport vehicles and the trains in the Calgary region. Okay, so this is the heavy duty trucking. And The Alberta Transport has this wonderful website. Found it's interesting to go through. It looks at transportation in Alberta and it does mapping and it shows all the Alberta highways. And when you click on each of these roads in the map, it pops up effectively details on how many trucks and cars are moving on that particular highway every day. And we can take that information and analyze it. And we've done that for all the roads here. The road going from, well, certainly the ring road in Calgary and the Highway 2 through the center of Calgary. That's the only ones we've looked at within the Calgary itself. And then from the ring road here to the ring road in Edmonton. And from this ring road on side the west side of Calgary out to the Banff National Park, on the east side to the Saskatchewan border, and on the south side down to the US border. And then from those, we take about, so assume that 75% of the tractor trailers running would be hydrogen, maybe the other 25% battery electric or biofuel, and about 50% of the single unit trucks being hydrogen. With those numbers, the actual refueling demand in Calgary is estimated to be, for trucks running this route, about 52 tons of hydrogen a day. Running the route to, through to Medicine Hat and the Saskatchewan border, about 19, and 11 down to the US and 8 over to the Banff. And whereas in the running the ring roads and Highway 2, just in the Calgary region, 32 tons of hydrogen a day. Total of 122 tons. This is an absolute minimum estimate, we would guess. And it's really just the heavy trucks running these highways, not other roads within the regions. And we see that sort of the 4 ton a day that we've talked about in this region is really a relatively small fraction of that, and certainly I would argue doable and needs to be sort of the scale that we need to be looking at as we move forward in trying to commercialize some of these early learnings. This chart shows the location of the current truck stops and card locks and trucking, refueling stations on the trucking companies. Actually, the blue is the trucking companies here within the Calgary region. And, then this just tells you where they are now. The new hydrogen fueling could either be provided at some of these existing stations or at greenfield sites that might be built around the city. And there's a lot of interest in looking at some new greenfield sites because the demands for a hydrogen filling station, can be quite a large space because you need large tanks and containers. So I think greenfield is probably more likely in the longer term, but maybe some early stage could be putting some on some of these existing sites. Let's switch to now look at the city of Calgary and look at the potential hydrogen demand to decarbonize city-owned vehicles. And we were able to obtain in 2019 numbers from the city of Calgary. The amount of fuel energy that is used in their transit fleets includes their 60-foot buses, their 40-foot shuttle buses, as well as other non-transit vehicles owned by the city of Calgary. And our analysis of this is which on each of these, we did a fairly detailed analysis to which of these we felt was best split between, say, battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric in a transition to zero emission fuels. There's also a possibility of renewable natural gas. We looked at, there's some big challenges for renewable natural gas in the decarbonization strategy we talk about later if you like, but so we just looked at the battery electric. We basically estimated the proportion of existing bus fleet that would be replaced by hydrogen is shown in the blue here. And totally they come up to about 9.7 tons of hydrogen a day. So that would be to meet to what the hydrogen production and demand would be by these vehicles. And that takes into consideration that a fuel cell electric vehicle, especially buses, get a much better fuel efficiency, if you like, in terms of energy used per kilometer than a diesel engine, because partly of regenerative stop and go and better fuel efficiency, as we've learned from some of the preliminary work in Edmonton. The city of Calgary also has a lot of heat and power demand in its city infrastructure. In total, it uses about 1,800 terajoules per year. A lot of it is in the wastewater treatment plants, both the Bonnie Brook, Fish Creek, Pines Hill, Bears Paw. They're major users of natural gas. The transit, bus transit also as well for, washing the buses and there's a lot of energy use in transit. There's rapid transit and the Village Square Leisure. About 50% of all the natural gas used is in these top 10 facilities. And so we looked at what would be the implications of moving those to hydrogen. And it'd be about 18.4 tons of hydrogen per day. But the reality is many of these same facilities and some other facilities actually use a lot of electricity as well. And right now, that electricity tends to be taken from the grid and therefore has a fairly high carbon intensity. And so one possibility is we pick those facilities, like some of the wastewater treatment plants, which have both a high electricity use and a high natural gas use, and say, what about the feasibility of putting combined heat and power, where hydrogen is going through basically a reciprocal engine and it's generating electricity, and the waste heat is being used to heat the building. And in that case, we were looking at 35 tons of hydrogen a day, and it would provide top 10 of the buildings and meet their heat requirements, but also meet their electricity requirements, and in fact put quite a lot of extra electricity on the grid as a very low carbon electricity because it's coming from low carbon hydrogen. And then that's another opportunity that I think could be explored to see whether that might work at one or more of these facilities. So in summer, if we look at the city of Calgary itself, it has a potential for maybe 6.2 tons a day for transit of hydrogen, and other vehicles 3.5 tons, building heat and power 35 tons a day. So a total about 44 tons a day of hydrogen. And as mentioned by Zach previously, these are going to require, the building heat and power is going to require pipelines in order to make it work, or if possible, on-site production of the hydrogen, low-cost hydrogen. Whereas these transportation opportunities, there is a possibility, at least in the interim, to bring in hydrogen as liquid hydrogen by truck. Then we can turn our attention to the airport, the Calgary airport. And then what are the potential markets there? When you actually look at energy use in the Calgary International Airport, the vast majority of energy use is jet fuel. 656 million liters per year. This is 2019, pre-COVID. This is the demand for jet fuel. And all the other fuel use is a little bit of the lines at the top of this bar chart. We'll talk about them in a minute. Let's just talk about the jet fuel. There's a lot of discussion in longer term views that, liquid hydrogen would be a fantastic jet fuel because it's so light. The problem is it carries a lot of volume. So you'd have to totally redesign the airplanes, totally new kinds of engines and new shapes of the airplanes to handle large volumes of fuel. And that's certainly possible. There are companies that are doing it. You can look them up on the web. You got these really neat looking airplanes that are hydrogen airplanes that are being designed. But I think for the foreseeable future, we really need to be looking at drop-in aviation fuels. And the airline industry has identified sustainable aviation fuels as the likely answer for at least the next 30 years. It's really interesting, those sustainable aviation fuels are going to be made primarily from biofuels. But in order to upgrade the biofuels, the biomass feedstocks, typically at this stage, the oil plant oils, like from canola, it requires hydrogen to upgrade it. And our estimate is that to make this amount of jet fuel just used by the Calgary airport, it would take about 37 tons of hydrogen per day would be required to upgrade that canola oil to make it into a drop-in jet fuel. And that's that creates a really quite an interesting opportunity, a strategic opportunity, I think, for the Calgary area working in partnership with the airlines at the Calgary airport to possibly start to make sustainable aviation fuels and bring them to the airport. Now we look at the other bars at the top of the graph, and we can expand them out. And there's gasoline, diesel, and natural gas that is used also at the airport. If we take the gasoline and diesel, there's actually used in vehicles that are running around inside the airport, and putting them to hydrogen is about 1.7 tons of hydrogen per day for those vehicles. There's also been a lot of talk in the media and I know in behind closed doors on a possibility of a hydrogen train that would go from the airport to downtown or in perhaps all the way to Banff. And we've estimated that this would add another about 4 tons of hydrogen per day. So we got about 5.7 tons of hydrogen for potential for transportation in the airport. To natural gas use is primarily for water and space heating in the airport. And that's going to be, if we just did the natural gas for heating, it's 7.5 tons a day. But if we actually decided that, the airport also uses a lot of electricity that it takes from the grid. We wanted to do what we talked about for the city of Calgary is to, in a few of the buildings, is to look at using hydrogen to not only provide heat, but provide electricity through a cogen. It could be up to 30 tons a day, but you'd also decarbonize the electricity supply. And so what we are talking about here is in addition to the 37 tons of hydrogen for jet fuel, up to 36 tons of hydrogen to meet the energy requirements for the airport itself that's not involved with the jet fuel side. The railway in Alberta, especially in Calgary, is a exciting opportunity, largely because of some of the work that CPKC has been doing. If you look at the blue lines on this chart here is Canadian National Railways, and the red are the Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Railway, and together within the Calgary region, we're able to get numbers that estimate that about 58 million liters of diesel is used by the trains within this region. Most of it is used for long haul where the fueling is done and the trains go off to Edmonton or to other parts of, they go west to Vancouver or whatever. But that's about the amount of fuel that's used that's consumed by trains in this region. If we converted that into, what's the estimate of hydrogen, taking into consideration that fuel cell vehicles are more efficient than diesel engines, it'd require about 24 tons of hydrogen per day. And already we know that CPKC has already built a hydrogen fuel cell locomotive, the one shown here, and it's starting to test it. And I just pulled this from the CPKC website the last couple of days. So if we do the bottom-up estimates, we're talking, 122 for heavy-duty vehicles just on the major highways, 9.7 potentially for the city of Calgary, the airport, another 5.7, the trains in the Calgary 24, 161 tons of hydrogen a day. The idea of, starting with that 4 tons a day that we talked about, I think this is doable. That's kind of a minimum estimate. I'd say this is a minimum estimate we'll see what a higher estimate is from the top down in a minute. And then on heat and power, at least 65 tons a day. And obviously that's just hitting the city of Calgary, major buildings and the airport, for a total of over 200 tons of hydrogen per day. Let's now look at a top-down estimate. So we've kind of done bottom up and say, well, these are maybe some strategic early stage opportunities, maybe with some stakeholders that might be interested in cooperating on developing hydrogen demand and trying to create new value chains. Let's look at what the theoretical potential is top down. And we've basically looked at this from a provincial estimates and then said, okay, the Calgary region is 37% of the province. So we're looking now at end-use demand for fossil fuels in non-energy sectors, light-duty buses, medium-duty, heavy-duty trucks, rail, planes, and off-road vehicles, 455 petajoules. That's pre-COVID 2019 numbers. And over here, we have the amount used of fossil fuels consumed in buildings, 330 petajoules. And down here, we've got just the electrical grid, and this is 310 petajoules of electricity only in the entire Alberta grid. Let's just take one of these at a time, all right? In the fossil fuel for transportation, for each of these sectors, in our analysis within the transition accelerator, we see, hydrogen will play a very small role within light-duty vehicles, a bigger role in buses, medium-duty vehicles, a pretty small role, maybe 20% at most. Heavy-duty trucks, absolutely. This is where hydrogen's really needed, and rail. And when you add all of this up, it's about 27% of the overall, existing fossil carbon use would be transitioning to hydrogen. And that works out to about 865 tons of hydrogen. That's in the transportation in the Calgary region, which is 37% of Alberta. So that's a big number compared to even certainly compared to the 4 tons a day that we talked about in the pilot or in the early commercialization project that I was proposing. For buildings, the potential is depending a little bit on, what proportion of our space heating goes to heat pumps or not. You can see we've said about a 70% to hydrogen here. Maybe that's a little bit high, but in terms of current thinking, but nonetheless, given that number, there's 652 tons of hydrogen. It's even bigger, right? But again, this would require pipelines. For power generation, where hydrogen has a real opportunities in 2 areas. One is in simple cycle, basically replacing natural gas singles at the peak power when you don't have wind and solar, and also in cogeneration, where you're trying to generate heat and power so you can get more energy out of a given unit of energy that goes in. And those numbers are again quite large, taking us up to over 4,600 tons of hydrogen a day as potential. And of course, the last 3 of these would require pipeline infrastructure and probably large centralized autothermal reforming CCS with to hydrogen production at scale, essentially creating the lowest cost, low carbon hydrogen that we could produce within the province in order to make them economically viable. So let's now, that's kind of on the demand side. What I'd like to do is just say a few things about opportunities for low GHG supply, and then wrap this up. There's a lot of ways of making hydrogen, which is, there's the ones on the left over here in black and brown are pretty high emissions hydrogen. This is the standard way to make hydrogen today. We take natural gas through steam methane reforming to make hydrogen. And we can make byproducts of it. So we can make ammonia or methanol from that. And those 2 gases could be converted back to hydrogen if we wanted as well. That's a possibility. The ones over here on the right, from gasification all the way through to the blue and green ones here, are actually the low GHG emissions, considerably low. And the further you go to the right, typically the lower they are. And we aren't going to get into a lot of detail on this, but what I would say, if the Calgary region really needs to deploy CCS at industrial scale in order to make the most cost-effective hydrogen, but the problem is centralized production. It costs a lot to move that hydrogen around. So that opens up a significant opportunity, I think, for the Calgary region to, and especially in the next few years, to focus on distributed smaller scale production where it is needed, like biomethanol to hydrogen, for example, or biomass gasification to hydrogen. And if you can put CCS on later, it can become even negative carbon emissions. So every time you use hydrogen, you're actually effectively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. We also have a very strong solar and wind regime in the Calgary region, better than Edmonton, I would argue. And so there's a very significant opportunity for solar and wind or other carbon-free power to be made into hydrogen. And for methane pyrolysis is another one that I think holds a lot of opportunity within the Calgary region. This is, if we're going to be delivering hydrogen, this is taken from the Air Products website, and the Air Products has this liquid hydrogen delivery truck. It holds about 2 tons of liquid hydrogen in this truck. It's about 30 feet long, and it could bring fuel to the stations, or it is possible to actually bring fuel directly to the trucks needing refueling. Of course, that's going to be more expensive. But for the hydrogen to serve markets for heat and power, we also need to think about hydrogen pipelines. But this is a technology which is available today that and will be coming online, I think, in the Edmonton region to move hydrogen around the province, and that could help to provide hydrogen supply needs. If we're looking at pipelines, we can look at the ATCO natural gas transmission system. And now the red lines on this chart, this is the Calgary region here. There's Calgary in the middle. This is the Calgary region. Most of the transmission pipelines cannot be used with pure hydrogen. They're not compatible. And so one would need to replace the transmission pipelines. But at each of these purple dots here, these are called gates, where the high pressure transmission natural gas in the high pressure lines is dropped to lower pressure distribution lines. And most of the distribution pipelines in this region are hydrogen compatible. We'd still need to replace, the meters and some of the valves and things if you're moving it from a natural gas pipeline to a hydrogen pipeline. if you're moving to pure hydrogen. But one could actually do hydrogen blending, and where you're putting some hydrogen in. And that can be done right at the gates as well. You can put some hydrogen here and get partial hydrogen with natural gas. And currently, this has not been approved by regulators in the province of Alberta. I think it really needs to be, and I'm hoping, my understanding is it will be going before decision makers in 2025. And I do hope that they look at this, because it will, without doing it, it's going to really hold back the hydrogen economy. Ultimately, natural gas needs to be replaced, though, with pure low GHG hydrogen. And it's certainly important to have demonstration, early stage commercialization projects are critically needed to do this. And ATCO is starting to do some of that, as we mentioned previously, and I think more is needed. One of the things that could be done in the Calgary region is to really look at the opportunity by some pipeline corridors that currently exist but aren't being used. There's on the black lines on this graph show in the Calgary region the existence of abandoned natural gas pipelines. So the pipeline corridor exists. It may be possible to repurpose those and move them for hydrogen or even for CO2 and sequestration. There's also discontinued natural gas pipelines, where the pipelines still exist and there's not been abandoned, but they're discontinued. It is possible to put maybe a liner down them that can carry hydrogen, and we can see where these are, and these are in some strategic areas, even going right through to the airport. And we even have a discontinued jet fuel pipeline that already exists. So I'd like to end then by just identifying a project that this is Calgary is really now recently come out. People in this area might have seen a call for proposals back in October for a source of hydrogen supply, but they're working to test a number of municipal hydrogen vehicles that they're looking at two kinds. We're looking at fuel cell electric vehicles, forklift truck, passenger vehicles, an excavator, and backhoe and another classic truck with an internal combustion engine that also burns hydrogen. And they're also looking to retrofit maintenance bays at two of their garages to support the hydrogen vehicles. And all I'd say is watch the City of Calgary website for requests for proposals is provided here. And there are going to be some more opportunities coming out soon, I'm understanding. And Philippa Wagner is the one who's handling this. So with that, I would end my comments. There is an opportunity for you to pull your phone out and scan this webinar survey and then fill out the survey. And I know Zach would be very pleased if you did that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. Excellent presentation. We have a ton of questions here, and some seem to be going down a few different threads. I'm going to try to tie them together just in the interest of time. So, you talked about corridors, and some of the, like a minimum viable corridor. Do you have any kind of idea of the capital needed to do so? And tying in a question from the audience here is, how would that look like, especially accounting for putting capital towards maybe retrofitting or using dual fuel vehicles instead of totally replacing them brand new? What would your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's both good questions. In the proposal that I laid out there at the start of the presentation, I have done some back of the envelope calculations, and I estimate it would cost an incremental cost over what the normal cost to, produce that number of vehicles and run them on the highways. It would be about another $300 to $400 million. But that is actually only about, it sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But the reality is it's about probably 15 or 20% of the actual cost to do it anyhow. This is a very large industry that, for the number of vehicles sold, et cetera, and the number. So we're talking about an incremental cost. And it's going to be the cost that is over a 10-year period. That's not a per year cost. That is a 10-year cost. And the cost is high at the start in the first 40 or 50 vehicles, you got it, but the prices would come down, as well as the cost to deliver the transport, the fueling stations and the hydrogen. So, in the end, we're talking a cost per ton of CO2 reduction would be, by the time you got to the end of it, would be well under $100 a ton of CO2. But, certainly the upfront cost is very high. And that's one of the challenges. This does need government engagement in order to make this happen. We're not going to see this, this kind of a transformation happen without government support, right?
And
In terms of the hydrogen diesel dual fuel, I think that's I'm actually quite keen on hydrogen diesel dual fuel vehicles. I think they need to be more testing and open analysis of how much hydrogen they use compared to the diesel fuel. There's needs to be more open and transparent publication of those results in order to really make the decision. And I think one of the nice thing about hydrogen diesel dual fuel, the incremental cost relative to just a regular diesel engine is relatively small compared to a complete transformation to a fuel cell vehicle. The challenge is you've got to put more vehicles to keep the fueling station going. You need, because they don't use near as much hydrogen as a fuel cell vehicle. So one would need more of them in order to keep the fueling stations happy. But I think ultimately the real solution is probably a mix of both. We have some hydrogen diesel dual fuel and some fuel cell electric. One of the benefits of hydrogen diesel dual fuel is that if you run out of hydrogen, you can run those vehicles on pure diesel. So it's a little reduces some of the risk to the carrier.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a couple questions kind of regarding competition to hydrogen. Certainly, I think this is more in regards to the long haul sector. What are the main technologies competing with hydrogen in long haul? And then in terms of the distances traveled, there was some question, what are long haul distances really in terms of, daily kilometers driven, and how does that affect technology choice?
Well, I think in terms of the alternatives, a lot of in zero emission long haul transportation, there are many companies there's in Europe, they tend to look more at electric vehicles, but they're heavy duty vehicles more like 30 to 40 tons, whereas in Canada, there's 63.5 metric tons gross vehicle weight. So, heavier vehicles here, there's the big tandem, the B trains and A trains that have a much higher. Our climate is colder in the winters for sure, and our distances are a lot longer. The numbers that I showed today in talking with many of the long haul companies that are working with they're members of the Alberta Motor Transport Association. The numbers I showed today of 200,000 kilometers a year in long haul transport are not out of line. In fact, I was told they may be a little low, right, in some cases, right? As you well know, when a long haul you're hired, you're basically the driver gets in, they can ride a long day, and you can go a lot of kilometers if you're working a 10 or 12-hour day. So, and as we move in the future, we may move to even more autonomous trucking, and that makes that drives the movement towards hydrogen fuel cell vehicles even more. I would say if we started to have autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks on the road, but we're not there yet. So I think we're talking the big scale. There is an opportunity for hydrogen in shorter haul vehicles return to base operations as well. And I think a lot of it, and especially in Alberta, where I think our hydrogen prices could come down and be competitive with diesel, and our electricity grid is not, very low carbon. So it is hard. It's even the carbon intensity of electricity grid in electric vehicles, you can still do better than a diesel vehicle, but you're not anywhere near close to a zero emission on a life cycle basis.
Great. And we have a couple questions regarding transporting hydrogen, of course. Certainly some questions about the state and role of liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And perhaps you can just riff on that a little bit if there's any other rules of thumbs with transporting hydrogen that you know of, or anything on that.
I'm actually excited about some of the liquid organic hydrogen carriers. The challenge, you got to get it in the right niche. There's an opportunity, but you're carrying a lot. The typical in a liquid organic hydrogen carrier, only 6% of your weight that you're carrying is hydrogen, if at most, and often less than that. And it takes energy to get the hydrogen back out of the carrier, and then you've got to carry the carrier back again. But I suppose if you got a vehicle that's going back anyhow, might as well carry the hydrogen carrier without the hydrogen and carry it back. There are some challenges there. I think pilots need to be tested with that, and demonstration projects we need more of that. And I think there's some significant opportunities for that to happen within the Calgary region as well. And I think we need to try out lots of these different options. Ultimately, we have to look, of course, at the economics, but also actually the sustainability, the environmental footprint of it all. But there's some exciting technologies being developed, and I think we want to be open to them, but they have to be put through a filter that decides which ones make the most sense.
Great. Now we have another interesting question talking about is there any financial opportunity in the Calgary area to capitalize on solid carbon if it was produced in terms of methane pyrolysis locally?
Well, that's a great. I mean, there's a number of companies in Western Canada looking at taking natural gas and methane, essentially, pyrolyzing it into hydrogen and carbon black. And it would be very nice if the carbon black that one was producing was not just, quote, carbon black, but actually had graphene properties or properties of that gave it extra value. It doesn't take very much methane pyrolysis before you saturate the market for carbon black in rubber tires and black paint and other things. There's a lot of carbon black that's used in that, but what's going to drive down the price of that when you overproduce carbon black? But what we need is to find new markets for carbon black, and I would love to see. I know there's some researchers that I've talked to that are looking at uh, carbon black or versions thereof to be for electricity storage, maybe a grid level storage of electricity. If one could make it into sort of a capacitors essentially, or large scale storage of using that carbon in that way. We're not there yet, and I think it's certainly an R&D opportunity. But again, we want to be able to test out these ideas, and I think we could see the possibility of creating some pretty exciting opportunities for jobs and economic development if we could crack that one. Getting value in carbon black would open up a huge opportunity for Alberta. Not
Great.
only in Alberta, across Canada.
Great. Well, that sounds very exciting. I guess we only have 1 minute left, so I'll ask one really quick question. We have a question about the Azatec project. I know you've been very involved in that, the inception. So someone's asking for an update. Maybe you'd be able to provide what you know.
Yes, the Azatec project, the second truck is supposed to arrive in Edmonton tomorrow. And I hope they'll be on the road. We'll see them. They'll be, they've got the one truck's already in Edmonton, and it's been early stages getting ready for trials. In January, the second truck arrives tomorrow. I've been told it's been on the road for the last couple of days, and I think by early January they're talking about having these into trials, and maybe even before Christmas. I think the AMTA in Edmonton is biting at the bit to get these vehicles trialed. There'll be 63.5 ton gross vehicle weight tractors capable of hopefully pulling heavy loads between Calgary and Edmonton. So really the first of their kinds. Right?
Wonderful. Well, with that, I would really like to thank you, Dave, and thank everyone for
Thank you.
attending, and really thank our partners in this, the Calgary Economic Development of Wheatland County, and really encourage everyone to fill out the post webinar survey, and we hope to be providing more future webinars for you of interest. Thanks.
Thank you.